The Crimean War is perhaps the most well-known conflict of the mid-Victorian era. The reasons for this are many and varied. Perhaps it's the legendary destruction of the British light cavalry at the Battle of Balaklava as they charged into the Russian guns. Or perhaps the stand of the 93rd at that same action. Conversely, it could also be the lamentable tales of woeful neglect suffered by the men as they manned their positions in the trenches and on the approaches to Sevastopol. Amongst these incredible actions and details, one event in particular rises above all others. For there is no better example during the war of the skill, determination, and sheer doggedness of the soldier of the rank and file than was displayed at the Battle of Inkerman, known ever after as the Soldiers' Battle. The war was in fact far more involved than any fighting in the Crimea would suggest, and, like so many other wars, it started in the powder keg that was the Balkans. With initial political tensions growing surrounding the rights of Christian minorities in the Holy Land, action was first joined in what was present-day Romania, with a Russian incursion into what was, at the time, Ottoman territory. This led Britain and France, among other smaller nations, to rally around the Ottoman Empire, each for their own reasons. But in Britain, the long-standing tension created by Russian interests in the Far East, namely India, all had a role to play. By the beginning of 1854, forces were assembling, and in late February the first British troops boarded their troopships and began the voyage east. They landed in present-day Turkey and ultimately encamped at Scutari, near present-day Istanbul. There they remained until circumstances saw them deploy to face the Russian threat in the Balkans, landing at Varna on the west coast of the Black Sea in late May. Nothing of note came of this move except for perhaps some foreshadowing of what was to come. Ineptitude and unprofessionalism began to show their face as the campaign quickly stalled with a Russian withdrawal, leaving the Allied armies with very little to do. With people in Great Britain eager for some decisive action, it was decided to attack the main Russian naval base at Sevastopol in the Crimea. Thus the army boarded its troop ships and headed to sea. Landfall was made on a huge expanse of open beach at Kalamata Bay. The landing was unopposed, but plagued with shortcomings and decrepit administrative oversight. Eventually, the bulk of the army was ashore, and it began its advance south towards Sevastopol. The British army that sailed to the east in 1854 was one that was at a crossroads. While it did indeed have one foot firmly planted in its traditional past, it was on the very cusp of making a significant bound forward with the other. For the years since Waterloo, it had been controlled by the heavy hand of the Duke of Wellington, who, in old age, had maintained the belief that the army needed very little in the way of change from the state it had been in 1815. Wellington passed away in 1852, and the nation mourned. 2 years later, Wellington's longtime military secretary, who had by then been raised to the peerage as the first Baron Raglan, was given command of the Army of the East, as the assembled forces were to be known as. Dress and weaponry had changed in detail since the peninsula, but not fundamentally. The army left the shores of Great Britain clad in its finest home service full dress. The red and scarlet of most of its ranks was adorned with much decoration and finery. The cut of its uniforms was very much the same as it had been for the last 40 years. The line infantry wore a red coatee with various regimental and company distinctions. The most conspicuous of these was the facing color, peculiar to each regiment, shown on the cuffs, shoulder straps, and collar. In full dress, the Albert pattern shako was worn. It derived its name from the prince consort who had maintained a hand in its development. There were other variations, of course. These included the guards, resplendent in their bearskin caps and large epaulets. The rifle brigade in their customary dark or rifle green uniform. And of course, the Highlanders, conspicuous in their kilts, hairsporns, and feather bonnets. For wear as a forage or undress cap, the knitted Kilmarnock bonnet was used by nearly the entire army. The Rifle Brigade had theirs in the customary rifle green. There were, of course, the necessary deviations from the norm. The Guards were issued a peculiar pattern of field cap. Universal across the brigade, it could be worn fore and aft, side to side, or with one or both of the peaks folded down. Highland regiments wore a peculiar mix of the dark blue Kilmarnock and diced and undiced Glengarries. The cavalry, too, wore their uniforms according to regiment, with the heavy cavalry in red, whilst the light cavalry wore blue. There were variations within each to include dragoons, dragoon guards, lancers, hussars, and light dragoons. The men of the Royal Artillery wore blue. Equipment had changed in detail, though not substantially since the Peninsula. Ammunition was carried in a black leather pouch slung over the left shoulder containing some 60 rounds. This was complemented by a belt over the right shoulder from which was slung the bayonet, the two being joined in the center of the chest by a brass plate. Only recently, in 1850, had a waist belt with an attached frog been introduced to replace the shoulder-worn style. As it was, the Army of the East was equipped with a mixture of these patterns of equipment. For necessities, the box knapsack was used, stiffened by wooden panels and topped with a greatcoat or blanket and mess tin. It was generally uncomfortable and unergonomic. Water and food were carried in a wooden keg-style water bottle and haversack, respectively. Their arrangement in the Crimea was at this time quite ununiform. One interesting feature of the percussion arm era was the way that the caps were carried. Typically, they were carried for immediate use in a small leather pouch, which was let into the coatee on the lower right side. This carried enough for immediate use, with the remainder in the main pouch or elsewhere. This method was used with both types of equipment, either the shoulder or the waist belt, although with the latter, a small brown leather pouch could also be used. There was no hard fast rule at this time, and examples of both were widespread. For extra warmth, the men were provided a long woolen greatcoat. This had an attached cape that fell over the shoulders for extra protection. For the landings in the Crimea, it was decided that the men's state of health was not up to the task of carrying the knapsack. Instead, its removable straps were used to bundle together a blanket, the greatcoat, and the mess tin, along with whatever else the men could stuff inside. This formed somewhat of a blanket pack. This was perhaps okay for the short term, but even by Inkerman, the knapsacks had not yet been recovered, and the men were deprived of their sorely needed contents, such as spare socks and underclothes. This was to be yet another of the many horrific failures of the supply and commissariat system used in the Crimea. Shameful, really. By the time of Inkerman in November, winter was looming, and the greatcoats were in constant use. Relatively thin, they were the men's only extra layer at hand. The tall, felt shakos had long since disappeared, replaced nearly entirely by the Kilmarnock. Thus, the British Army marched to war in 1854. Never again would an army depart the shores of the United Kingdom dressed so finely. While the army may have looked old-fashioned, even for the 1850s, there was the beginnings of a paradigm shift taking place. This was driven by the arm carried by the infantry. For the first time ever in British and Empire history, every man was to have a rifle. Up until this point, the infantry had been armed with what was essentially a percussion version of the venerable Brown Bess, either the P-39 or the P-42. Rifles had been the preserve of a few select rifle regiments, armed with the Brunswick. Initially fielded in small numbers in South Africa in the early 1850s, the P-51 Minié rifle was produced and hurriedly issued to 4 of the 5 divisions of infantry sailing for the east. Only the 4th Division remained equipped with the smoothbore P-42. This was indeed the beginnings of a massive paradigm shift, and much training was undertaken during the voyage and while the army was at Scutari, so that the new and dramatic capabilities of this weapon could be understood. Indeed, a revolution in infantry weapons was taking shape. The capabilities of the P-51 became readily apparent, and as we shall see, the outcome of the Battle of Inkerman would be heavily influenced by its capabilities. The bullet had a hollow base, and in this was placed a small iron cup. This way the bullet could be made smaller than the bore, theoretically making it as easy to load as the smooth bore it replaced. But when fired, the expanding gases would drive the iron cup into the base cavity, pushing what was known as the skirt of the bullet out, thereby gripping the rifling, which imparted a spin on the bullet, giving it far greater stability and accuracy. The army was organized on lines that would have been familiar to any soldier of the Peninsular War, and indeed any other that soldiered on later in the century. The building block was the infantry battalion. For the Crimea, the battalion contained 12 companies, 8 of which were service companies, and 4 were depot companies left back in the UK to train and forward recruits and reinforcements for the field battalion. Most regiments only had one battalion at this time, but some, like the Guards, the Rifle Brigade, and some of the more senior line regiments, like the 1st of Foot or Royal Scots, had 2 or more. To those uninitiated into the British regimental system, the nuances of terminology can be a bit confusing. But the regiment was a cultural entity, whilst the battalion was the operational one. Thus, the 3rd Battalion Grenadier Guards, or the 2nd Battalion, the Rifle Brigade. In single battalion regiments, and indeed the vast majority were, there was no need to differentiate. The battalion was nominally about 1,000 men in strength, although by the time of the landings in the Crimea, every battalion was quite under strength, and by the time of Inkerman, woefully so. Each battalion had 2 companies specially designated as the Grenadier and the Light Company. These distinctions were mostly traditional by the 1850s, as all companies were supposed to be proficient in extended order or light infantry tactics. The battalions were organized, generally 3 at a time, into brigades, and 2 of these were grouped together into divisions under the command of a general officer. The cavalry were organized along similar lines, although the 2 British brigades of mounted men had 5 regiments in each brigade. The artillery, in their blue uniforms, were grouped into field batteries of 4 guns and 2 howitzers. Before we move forward in this presentation, there are a few historical notes that bear mention. The first is regarding the arm used in the production of this series. The venerable P-53 Enfield rifle musket. The P-53 was not used at the Battle of Inkerman, and in fact did not even get to the Crimea until the following year. The weapon used by the majority of the British infantry in 1854 was the P-51 Minié rifle. Outwardly similar, the earlier rifle differed in many aspects, including various cosmetic features, such as the lack of barrel bands. As well, the caliber was much greater, at .702 versus the .577 of the Enfield. Very simply, I do not own or have access to a P-51, but for the purposes of demonstrating drill and capabilities in this video, the P-53 does duty as an acceptable stand-in. Perhaps more importantly, both weapons share a similar style of ammunition, using a smooth-sided expanding ball in a lubricated paper cartridge. Viewers of the channel will be most familiar with this style of historical ammunition, and as such it does well to mimic that of the P-51 in loading technique. In addition to the arm, we must also mention some of the clothing and kit, for there were some necessary but minor liberties taken with some of the historical aspects. Fighting at Inkerman involved many, many different regiments. Rather than to try to have badges and accoutrements specific to the units in question at various points in the battle, I've chosen a somewhat generic adaptation of what was worn during the action. I've chosen 4 variations of dress to represent the various units involved. The Guards with the bearskin cap, the Guards with the field cap, a line infantryman in crossbelt equipment, and a line infantryman with waist belt. These are used where appropriate in telling the story.
Where the Guards examples might be fairly decent, the line examples show some details that may be just a little bit confusing. Take, for instance, the numerals on the Kilmarnock bonnet. The 57th was present at the battle, but was engaged later. It just happens to be the badge I chose to represent what was worn on the cap. You'll also note that the greatcoat is of a modern pattern. I've made the addition of a small cape to mimic that as was worn with period examples. But of course, it does differ in certain details. Those with a keen eye will immediately discover that the combination of waistbelt and frog does not conform specifically to the 1850 pattern, and perhaps more accurately represents something that was found later in the decade and into the 1860s. I can only hope that you understand the use of these necessary economies. The Russian army was very much a product of the regime. Conscripted for 25 years, the men in ranks were well drilled in mass maneuver, if somewhat at the expense of tactical nuance. It was large, and the forces available in the Crimea and committed to the Battle of Inkerman were well over 30,000. The infantry wore a green coat and a leather helmet, although like the British Army by the time of Inkerman, nearly all wore the brown-grey greatcoat, often with the skirts folded up and a flat profile forage cap. The Russians possessed great numbers of cavalry, although they, at the Battle of Inkerman, were not present in any substantial numbers. While the infantry were numerous, but perhaps lacking in tactical ability, the Russian army in the Crimea possessed a powerful artillery arm. Some 140 guns, both 12 and 18-pounders, were present at Inkerman. Their green-painted carriages and trails conspicuous against the grey of the British. The infantry were armed with a 70-caliber smoothbore percussion musket and bayonet. These were generally of two types, the 1845 pattern, purpose-made as a percussion weapon, and a conversion of the earlier flintlock version. Although that older weapon does also have some provenance as being used during the Crimean War. Rifles were employed along the same lines as the pre-Crimean British Army, in select rifle regiments. These carried a Russian version of the British Brunswick rifle, featuring different sights, as well as the use of a better bullet, of conical shape. This was perhaps a better choice than the belted round ball as used in the Brunswick in British service earlier in the century. The Russian infantry was organized into battalions of 4 companies, 3 or 4 battalions to a regiment, and thus were grouped by twos into brigades and hence into divisions and corps, where artillery, a rifle battalion, and a sapper battalion were attached. The French army that landed in the Crimea numbered some 30,000. Clad generally in the now familiar blue coat and red trousers, they had amongst their number regiments of the line, light infantry regiments, chasseurs, tirailleurs, and zouaves, each of which had their own distinctive types of dress. The cavalry, too, very much fit the national image. They were organized into regiments of 2 battalions while on campaign, each having 8 companies. The infantry were armed with what appears to be a collection of transitional pieces, somewhat older versions of what would become the rifle musket. The French would play a crucial role at the Battle of Inkerman. As we shall see, timely action by General Bosquet aided the precarious situation on the 5th of November. The Turks and Sardinians were other players during the war, but as neither of them were particularly involved at the Battle of Inkerman, they are the subject for another video, and will not be discussed in any detail here.
Having landed on the 14th of September, the army offloaded its supplies in the brief respite the Russians afforded them. It took 5 days before the army was ready to begin its advance on Sevastopol.
The army began to move south, and after a small skirmish at the Bulganek, the main Russian army was confronted at the river Alma in the battle of that same name. The outcome was in favor of the Allies, though the lack of vigorous pursuit after the battle was to have significant consequences later on. There was further delay, and finally on the 25th of September, the army marched again, continuing its ponderous movement towards Sevastopol. The decision was made to attack the city from the south, and this brought about an advance around the flank of the town. The Russians, under the command of Prince Menshikov, foresaw the coming siege and very quickly moved the bulk of the field army into the interior of the Crimea. The two armies nearly collided during this period, and in fact Raglan, the British commander, very nearly became captured by the Russian rearguard as he blundered into them, leading the advance south. The armies took up positions around the landward side of the city, each with their own supply base, the French at Kameshk and the British at Balaklava. The selection of these bases drove the general layout of the siege lines, with the British on the right and the French on the left, although this would change in detail later on in the war.
The siege lines were incomplete, and staggeringly, access to the city from the interior was never completely cut off.
Thus, the situation developed with the need to protect the parallels and siege batteries from the significant Russian army that was at large to the east and to the northeast. The Allied armies not only had to protect their siege, but also to protect their camps and supply bases, namely that at Balaklava. Thus, a series of defensive positions was created that ran along the escarpment to the east of Sevastopol. These linked up with other defenses around the port of Balaklava. To place all these locations in the proper context, perhaps a quick overview of the ground and general dispositions would be helpful. The terrain surrounding Sevastopol was dominated by the open but rolling Chersonese Plateau, which was cut by numerous ravines and valleys. At its northern edge lay the city of Sevastopol with its naval harbor. Across from the city there was a military fortification protecting it from attack from the north. The Chersonese Plateau ended abruptly east of the city, with an escarpment known as the Sapun Heights. This led down to lower ground, with the Chernaya River to the north, and a low ridge known as the Causeway Heights in the south. At the very south lay the harbor of Balaklava, surrounded by a collection of hills. French and Turkish positions were as such. Apart from the main camps and siege lines in the west, the French also manned a line of fortifications along the Sapun Heights. The troops stationed there were known collectively as the Army of Observation, and were there, along with some Turks, to protect the siege operations around the city from attack. These connected with a series of redoubts along the Causeway Heights, manned by the Turks. These fortifications, as well as those closer to Balaklava, protected that harbor from attack. Those defenses were manned by the Royal Marines and the balance of the Highland Brigade. Just outside Balaklava, near a village called Kadikioi, an important crossroads was garrisoned by the 93rd Highlanders. Tucked in near the bottom of the escarpment and behind the Causeway Heights was the camp of the Cavalry Division. The remainder of the British Army was up on the Chersonese Plateau, actively prosecuting the siege. The British sector of the siege lay to the east of the city, and their dispositions were governed by their efforts there. Supporting the attacks made along the spurs of high ground that led to Sevastopol, the divisions were encamped behind the trenches in parallels. The 3rd Division manned the trenches of the left attack, while the 4th Division manned the right. The Light Division supported the Lancaster Battery, as well as supporting other efforts. With the Highland Brigade of the 1st Division down on the plains with the cavalry, the remaining brigade, the Guards Brigade, was tasked with completing the picketing of the heights, along with the French. This left the 2nd Division on the northern flank of the whole siege, and their task was to protect the vulnerable area from immediate Russian incursion, either from Sevastopol proper or from the field army in the interior. As mentioned, the 2nd Division was given the task of occupying the heights to the east of the city that overlooked the Chernaya River and the ruins of an old fortress, which was part of the settlement of Inkerman. It would have been during the early part of the siege when the capabilities of the P-51 mini rifle would become manifest. As with any siege, in support of the powerful artillery, there remained a smaller war, one of individuals and small groups. Between the earthworks of these fortresses and the parallels of the siege lines, there existed a no man's land. Here, both sides would vie for dominance in a low-level game of cat and mouse. Sometimes larger sorties would occur, but often it was much smaller in scale. The P-51 delivered to the infantry such accuracy and range that it could be used to snipe at Russian gunners and patrols. Many anecdotes exist of this practice both early and late in the war. And it was at this time that a unit was formed from the constituent battalions of the Guards Brigade, numbering between 30 and 60 men, It was commanded by Captain Goodlake of the Coldstream Guards. These picked sharpshooters acted as a mobile patrol, actively engaged in the fight for no man's land. They weren't alone, of course. Other such groups were formed from other brigades and divisions, and indeed a great many brave souls were occupied in this kind of work, using the new P-51 rifle to great effect. At least 2 Victoria Crosses were won by such troops, the aforementioned Captain Goodlake and a Private McGregor of the Rifle Brigade. With the first bombardment opening on the 17th of October, it didn't take long for the Russians to organize and make a concentrated effort to lift the siege. Rather than attacking the siege lines and parallels before Sevastopol, they struck for the British supply depot at Balaklava. This small harbour was defended by a series of outworks, redoubts, placed along a low rise known as the Causeway Heights, just north of the town, as well as forces placed closer in. While not within the scope of this video, the Battle of Balaklava featured many incredible moments, including the charge of the Heavy Brigade, the charge of the Light Brigade, and the stand of the 93rd, along with the Turks. The Russians were only partially successful in their goal, and Balaklava remained operational. Despite their lack of total success at Balaklava, the Russians were not done. They decided that they would test the resilience of the siege lines proper. They chose for their effort the Inkerman Heights.
By far, the most important aspect of understanding any battle is examination and interpretation of the ground. The Battle of Inkerman was fought on the high ground east of Sevastopol over an area known as the Inkerman Heights. Inkerman Ridge formed the main piece of high ground. To the west and running parallel was Victoria Ridge, and to the south the Sept Heights stretched away towards Balaklava. The east and the north were bordered by the Chernaya River, which drained into Sevastopol harbor. On the opposite bank lay the ruins of Inkerman. Near the mouth of the river there was a bridge which led to the interior. On the north face of the heights, coming up from the water, there were prominent ravines and gorges, 2 of which, St. George's Ravine in the west and the Volovia Gorge in the east. These would play an important role in delivering Russian troops to the heights above. The south was bordered by the Korinij Ravine, which stretched from Sevastopol well into the British positions. It too formed an important route on the battlefield, as it had a road to help navigate along its length. There were a number of smaller re-entrants that branched off, and a series of caves in the walls of the ravine. One of these re-entrants branched off to the east and was known as the Mikriakov Glen. Further up the Korinij Ravine, the Wellway branched off to the southeast. Between the Wellway, the Mikriakov Glen, and the upper reaches of the Sept Heights lay one of the most dominating pieces of ground on the Inkerman Heights, Home Ridge, which, off its eastern and western ends, extended off 2 features, Fore Ridge in the east and the Mikriakov Spur on the west. The whole feature formed somewhat of a U-shaped hill. Beyond Fore Ridge, the ground extended out in a number of spurs and headlands, with deep ravines between. The southern of these was known as the Kit Spur, with St. Clement's Ravine and the rocky and prominent Inkerman Tust beyond. The largest ravine leading up from the Chernaya was the Quarry Ravine, which had a road known as the Post Road that ran its length up to and over Home Ridge. To the north of this ravine was a feature known as the East Jut. Dominating the center of the heights was a feature known as Shell Hill, which was salient in its position and slightly higher than Home Ridge. Sloping down off its western side, the ground extended out to a feature known as the West Jut, overlooking the Korinij Ravine. Juxtaposed to the fortifications and earthworks around Sevastopol were a number of small works that were placed not necessarily to confront the city's defenses, but rather to guard the Inkerman Heights and the right flank of the British Army. On Victoria Ridge, the Lancaster Battery, which housed a single gun and was the most northern part of the siege works actively engaging the defenses of Sevastopol.
Across the top of Home Ridge, along its length, an earthwork had hastily been thrown up by the gunners who had been manning their guns in that location. At the time of the battle, due to the rocky ground and lack of soil, this only amounted to a berm some 2 foot high. Forward of Home Ridge, blocking the post road as it rose out of the quarry ravine, was an earthwork known as the Barrier, some 3 or 4 feet high, although not as long as the example on Home Ridge behind. Even further out, off the end of Fore Ridge and near the top of the Kitspur, was the Sandbag Battery, which had been built to house 2 18-pounder guns, which had been used to deal with and silence the Russian guns across the Chernaya. This had been done, and the guns had withdrawn back to other tasks. The battery, however, remained in location, although empty. Behind Home Ridge lay the camp of de Lacy Evans' 2nd Division, who were supported from their positions guarding the Sapone Ridge by the Guards Brigade. Here, an overview of the Battlefield of Inkerman. One important aspect of the terrain that bears mention is the fact that much of it was covered in what was known as scrub oak. While not quite a forest, it nevertheless grew to a height that could conceal a man, and even great numbers of men. This scrub was to play havoc with maneuver and visibility, and indeed led in great deal to the character of the fighting that was to come. Now, obviously I have not been able to access the actual ground on the Inkerman Heights to make this series. I have had the opportunity, however, to use some fairly similar terrain, both in vegetation and ground cover. I hope that it will create a workable atmosphere, minus the forest and the mountains, of course. Thus, with the ground examined, it's important to understand the makeup of the forces that would come into action on the 5th of November. The British forces under Raglan that would eventually see action at Inkerman would be drawn from all 5 infantry divisions, to one degree or another. The 1st under the Duke of Cambridge, the 2nd commanded by Evans, the 3rd by England, the 4th by Cathcart, and the Light Division by Brown. Most of these men would wind up in the thick of action on the day. The 1st Division contained the Guards Brigade under Bentinck and the Highland Brigade under Campbell. Only the 3 Guards battalions, the 3rd Battalion Grenadier Guards, the 1st Coldstream Guards, and the 1st Scots Fusilier Guards, as they were then known, as well as the divisional artillery, would see action at Inkerman. The 2nd Division under Evans would end up being completely engaged, although on the day he was recovering in Balaklava after what appears to be a combination of an illness and a fall from his horse. And the division would be commanded at the battle by Brigadier Pennefather of the 1st Brigade. That brigade consisted of the 30th, the 55th, and the 95th Foot. The 2nd Brigade under Adams consisted of the 41st, 47th, and 49th Foot. The 3rd Division under England, being farthest to the south, was to see little action at the oncoming battle. Otherwise busy manning the trenches before Sevastopol, only the 1st, or Royal Scots, and the 50th would be destined to participate. Cathcart's 4th Division would see much action, with parts of every battalion being represented at the battle. The 1st Brigade, under Goldie, consisted of the 20th Foot, the 21st Royal North British Fusiliers, and the 57th Middlesex. The 2nd Brigade, under Torrance, was made up of the 46th, the 63rd, and the 68th Light Infantry. Elements of the 1st Battalion, the Rifle Brigade, would also participate in the battle. The Light Division under Brown would also commit a great number to the battle. Codrington's 1st Brigade, consisting of the 7th Royal Fusiliers, the 23rd Royal Welsh Fusiliers, and the 33rd, would be conspicuous in their support of the 2nd Division across the Careenage Ravine, while elements of Buller's 2nd Brigade, the 19th Green Howards, the 77th, and the 88th Connaught Rangers, as well as men of the 2nd Battalion, the Rifle Brigade, would be committed on the Inkerman Heights. Although the numbers of Russian forces available to Menshikov in the Crimea were far greater in number than were represented in the fighting at Inkerman, those actually engaged at the heights were as follows. It's important to note that there was quite a degree of movement of forces between the Field Army and Sevastopol from the time when the siege began until the Battle of Inkerman. The distribution of forces shown here reflect the order of battle on the morning of the 5th of November. I've chosen to break the Russian forces involved in the battle into 3 distinct groups. I've labeled them as corps. However, when one examines the minutiae, this may not necessarily be completely appropriate. For purposes of this video and the presentation, it explains things well enough. There was a grouping of divisions and parts thereof in Sevastopol under General Soimonov. There was an element of the field army that approached from the northeast during the battle, and this was under the command of General Pavlov. Lastly, another large element of the field army further to the south that had been involved in the battle at Balaklava was positioned adjacent the Sapun Heights. This was under the command of General Gorchakov. In Sevastopol, Soimonov was able to call on the services of some 19,000 men, grouped in 28 battalions, fielding 38 guns. This consisted of the 10th Division, with the Katerinburg, Tomsk, and Kolovansk regiments. The 16th Division, consisting of the Vladimir, Suzdal, and Uglitch regiments, was augmented by elements of the 17th Division, the Butursk Regiment, 2 companies of the 6th Rifle Regiment, and a company of sappers. Soimonov's guns were organized into 4 batteries, 2 heavy and 2 light. Pavlov's forces, and bear in mind that the designation of them shown here is very much my own, consisted of some 16,000 men, in 20-plus battalions, fielding 97 guns. The 11th Division contained the Selenginsk Regiment, the Yakutsk Regiment, and the Uglitch Regiment. This force also contained the balance of the 17th Division, its 2nd Brigade, including the Borodino Regiment, the Tyrolin Regiment, and 2 companies of the 4th Rifle Regiment. The 97 guns were organized into 9 batteries. Gorchakov had the balance of forces that had been used at Balaklava. These fielded some 22,000 men in 20 battalions with 88 guns. Included in this number were 7,000 cavalry. French troops committed on the 5th of November, under the overall command of General Canrobert, would consist of elements of 2 divisions, under General Bosquet, and Prince Napoleon, as well as some cavalry. General Bosquet's division would commit the 6th Regiment of the Line, the 7th Light Infantry, and the 3rd Battalion of the Chasseurs à Pied, as well as the 50th Regiment of the Line, 2 battalions of the 3rd Zouaves, and a battalion of Tirailleurs. 2 field batteries would also accompany. Prince Napoleon would see a lesser commitment from his division, which would not play any meaningful role, but rather would act in support behind Home Ridge. The 4th Chasseurs d'Afrique would be employed to a degree, and 2 batteries of horse artillery from General d'Alonville rounded out the French commitment. This brings us to the end of Part 1 of the series on the Battle of Inkerman. Hopefully it has set the stage for a deeper examination of the actions that took place on the Inkerman Heights in late October and early November of 1854. In the next part, we'll examine contemporary infantry formations and tactics, as well as discuss the events of the 26th of October, the battle known as Little Inkerman. The references used for the production of this video were many and varied. The late Michael Barthorpe's Crimean Uniforms and Heroes of the Crimea were of particular interest. In addition, the works of Patrick Mercer, the Osprey book on Inkerman, as well as his own book, Give Them a Volley and Charge, were very useful. Hugh Small's work, The Crimean War, and Michael Springman's The Guards Brigade in the Crimea rounded out the collection of modern books. The use of the historical work written in the 1870s by Kinglake provided a reasonable, detailed account of the steps and actions as seen at Inkerman. And to round it out, because it is British muzzleloaders after all, the Infantry Manual, which was an abstract written in 1847 of the earlier 1833 drill manual. This was the drill book that the infantry used during the Crimean War. A very special thank you goes to Harry, a serving member of the Grenadier Guards, who sent along a bearskin plume and a valise plate that did duty as the ammunition pouch plate for the shooting vignettes featuring Grenadiers. Thanks as well to Hugh Small of hughsmall.co.uk for the provision of his 3D imagery. This was of great help in producing all the 3D map work seen in the presentation. As well to Patrick Mercer for the use of some of his modern photographs of the area. These helped greatly in placing the contours and maps in a better light. Thanks too to my friends of the Die Hard Company of the Victorian Military Society for the use of some of their photographs regarding their Crimean War impressions. If you're in need of exceptionally high quality and historic ammunition for your P-53 Enfield, then stop by Brett's website, papercartridges.com. His work is of the highest quality, and his cartridges are the closest thing you'll find to an original anywhere. If you'd like to support the channel, please stop by our Patreon page. The link is in the description below.
And for more information on projects and updates between videos, follow us on our Facebook page.